Welcome back to France Elects, a special World Review podcast series on the French election from the New Statesman. I'm Ido Vock, Europe correspondent at the New Statesman. This week, we're discussing this seismic second round of the parliamentary elections, which took place on the 19th of June, and saw President Emmanuel Macron lose his majority, the United Left surge, and the far right returned with its largest parliamentary delegation since World War II.
Le peuple s'est exprimé.
The people have spoken, surmounting the obstacle of an unfair and unsuited electoral system. It decided to send a very powerful parliamentary group of National Rally MPs to the National Assembly. Which thus becomes a little more national. This group will be by far the largest in the history of our political family.
With me to discuss is Jeremy Cliffe, writer at large. Thanks for coming on. I know you're a favourite of many World Review podcast listeners, so it's good to have you back. So these election results are really quite unprecedented, at least in the recent history of the French Republic and of French democracy. What we've seen is a president who's recently elected, who won election just a few months ago, lose his parliamentary majority, which hasn't happened since 2002, since the parliamentary elections were moved to the same calendar as the presidential elections. So Macron's Ensemble alliance won 246 seats in parliament, which is about 33 seats off a majority. And the United Left, which we've spoken quite a lot about, the New Popular Ecological and Social Union, won 142 seats, which more than doubles constituent parties' representation in parliament. And there was a big surprise, which was the National Rally Marine Le Pen's far-right party, which won 89 seats, which is by far its best representation in parliament in its history. It triples its previous best contingent, which had happened in the 1980s when the electoral system was briefly made proportional, and that caused a kind of mini political earthquake. But this is probably more significant. So what do you make of these results? What's your kind of takeaway from this? I know you're writing your column on the French elections this week. What do you make of what just happened?
I mean, a lot of elections are called historic or historic turning points, but I think this one really does qualify for the term. So many of the old assumptions about the French Fifth Republic have been pushed aside by this result. The centrality of and the dominant power of the executive, that is to say the president, relative marginalization of the legislature seems now to be a thing of the past. The Republican front, whereby parties of the left and centre rally together to keep the far right out. As you say, this is at least the best the far right has done since the Second World War. I was discussing this with our colleague Gavin Jacobson yesterday. He reckons that you have to go back as far as the 1880s to find the sort of extreme nationalism in France as strong in a democratic legislature. Obviously, you can debate what democratic means in that term, but as it is now. And a lot of the old assumptions of the Republic have been pushed aside. We're clearly entering a period of enormous turbulence in French politics. It's not clear how Macron's going to manufacture the majorities he needs in the legislature. Obviously, the Assemblée becomes, with this result, a lot more central in the French political life. And we have this sort of new party system where the two dominant forces of post-war French politics, the Gaullists and the Parti Socialiste, are to some degree or another marginalized or subsumed into other blocs. So you now have this new three-block system of the NUP on the left, spanning the broad left, I suppose you'd say, Macron on the centre to the centre-right, and then obviously Marine Le Pen on the far right. So it's a total realignment of French politics. And I think, there's no roadmap really for where things go from here.
Yeah, and one of the things about these results is Macron doesn't have a majority, but there's no clear majority in any direction. The left doesn't have a majority. The far right doesn't have a majority. The only kind of conceivable coalition that could emerge is Macron's Ensemble plus the Republicans, the kind of by now fairly small centre-right party. It seems like it isn't going in that direction. There are many senior figures in the Republicans who've said they don't support a coalition with Macron propping up Macron. Before the election, you had many allies of Macron, the Prime Minister, Macron himself, many of his ministers and so on, saying the president needed to be given a convincing majority to avoid political blockages and to keep the country moving and so on. But of course, having an election means that it can go different ways, and it doesn't have to be a given that the president always wins the legislative election after their presidential election. If you have an election, it means that the president or any party can lose it. And indeed, Macron has won in a fashion, but the fact that there is no kind of convincing majority in any direction means that he is going to have to negotiate with different parties. At this point, it looks most likely on a kind of ad hoc basis without a kind of formal coalition with the Republicans. And what that means is we're going to get a sort of an extent, as you say, Parliament is going to become much more central in political decision making. It's historically been marginalized by presidents because they just get an automatic majority and the Parliament is kind of there as not a rubber stamp. It does have significance, but they haven't had to negotiate with it in the way that Macron is going to have to negotiate with Parliament now. And we're going to get a sort of an extent of parliamentarianism injected into the institutions of the Fifth Republic, which in general, at least for the past 20 years, have not been too accommodating to it and have been that aspect of the French institutions have been marginalized.
And in fact, for all of the, I think, largely understandable hand-wringing and concerns about stability of French politics in the coming years, to reintroduce some parliamentarianism into the French system is perhaps not such a terrible thing in a system that, as I and others have argued on the pages of the New Statesman, has become too centralized, has become too monarchical. We might want to come on to that in a bit, but I just wanted to add one other point, just on your point, Ido, about the difficulty for Macron of winning over even the sort of quote-unquote centre-right Républicain. There too he's going to have a challenge because that party spans the centre-right to actually quite hard-right elements. And I think that points to this kind of broader picture, which is I talked about these three blocks of the broad left, Macron plus the centre-right, then Marine Le Pen. And they all are, of course, very broad churches with a huge potential for internal fractiousness as well. NUP is this broad coalition ranging from Jean-Luc Mélenchon's La France Insoumise all the way through to the centre-left, remnants of the old Parti Socialiste and the Greens. Macron, as we've said, will have to forge some sort of a ad hoc or formal coalition between his centrists and sort of conventional conservatives. And then even on the far right, despite the fact that Le Pen did far better than many expected this historic result, there are, of course, still big question marks about the identity of her party's politics. There are divisions within the French hard right. We saw that with the brief-lived sort of emergence of Éric Zemmour at the election, even if he didn't end up doing very well. And so all three of these camps are very broad, big, baggy coalitions, dominated or united, actually, to the extent that they are, by the personalities of their leading figures, so Mélenchon, Macron, and Le Pen herself. And I think that dynamic will play an important part in the turbulence of the coming years. And I think just a final point on that is that there are certain question marks about the political longevity of all three of those. Mélenchon is relatively old. Macron can't run again in 2027. And some have questioned kind of how long Le Pen's dominance of the far right continues. And this is a story about three very broad and uncertain coalitions united primarily by figures who may not be, well, who certainly won't be there forever.
I actually don't know if I agree. I definitely think that's true of Macron's party. It's pretty clear that Macron's party has a lot of difficulty implanting itself on a local level or even a regional level. It's a party which exists at a national level, but at the kind of subnational level, whether it's regional, departmental, municipal, and so on, it really doesn't exist in the same way that you would expect a party of power to exist. But I think precisely the reason, for example, that the NUP, the left-wing union, was so successful is because the four constituent parties were allowed to maintain their identities. And I don't think they would have consented and agreed to this union if they had to merge into one party behind Mélenchon. And indeed, we've seen that Mélenchon has proposed to create a single parliamentary group in Parliament, which would be the single largest opposition faction in Parliament, and the three other parties. So there's Mélenchon's France Insoumise, and the three other parties, the Socialists, the Greens, and the Communists, have refused. And they've said this was an electoral pact. We got into it on the basis of being able to maintain our individual identities and to be able to sit as separate groups in Parliament, and we are not going to meld into a kind of wider Mélenchonist party. And precisely, I think it is that kind of acceptance of pluralism which allowed the NUP to do so well. And if Mélenchon had just demanded every party just get behind him, I'm not sure it would have had the same success. And on the far right, we should get into this, but these results are extraordinarily good for the far right. The Rassemblement National has increased its parliamentary representation 11-fold on the last parliament, despite, as Marine Le Pen correctly said in the intro, an electoral system which historically massively disadvantages the far right. Its parliamentary delegation will be 3 times bigger than its previous best score in the 1980s, which is a really very long time ago. This is an extraordinarily good result for the far right. It's something that almost nobody expected. Marine Le Pen herself clearly didn't expect it. And if there were doubts about the direction she was taking the party in, or her leadership, for the moment, those have very much been extinguished. If only for a relatively pedestrian reason, which is that parties in France get public subsidies based on the number of votes they get. And Marine Le Pen's party has had chronic financial difficulties, and these really good electoral results will mean that she will get millions of euros in public subsidies, which will put her party on a much better, much sounder financial footing, and allow her, for example, to repay that famous Russian loan, which so much was made of. So it just for that reason, these are really good results for Le Pen.
Yeah, I saw the figure of 10 million euros over the course of the legislative period for the...
I think it's even more. I think it's 15.
Yeah.
But yeah. So let's get into the far right. I think that the United Left kind of doubling its representation is one part of the story. But to me, the biggest story is really this far right surge. If the NUP doesn't create a single parliamentary group, then the Rassemblement National will be the single largest opposition faction in parliament, which is, as I've said, a huge success for Le Pen. What do you make of this kind of far right surge?
You and I were discussing this yesterday, but I think the first big question is this kind of political Cluedo, who done it? Who from the other parts of politics can be blamed for the fact that the RN had this unexpected surge in results on the weekend? And I guess my sort of starting point was that I think it's inexcusable that Macron's Ensemble party was so reluctant to endorse NUP candidates when they were in runoffs against Le Pen's candidates, most notably in Le Pen's own seat in the Pas-de-Calais, where a NUP candidate running against her, who should have been totally acceptable to the centrist Macronists, a kind of a green who'd campaigned against the far right and had really put up a strong opposition to Le Pen in her sort of home region, Marine Tondelier, and yet the local Ensemble candidate declined to support her and said that she would do a blank vote. And I suppose my starting point was that was bad, but it was also bad that Mélenchon and others in NUP weren't more energetic or weren't more explicit in asking their supporters in runoffs between the Macronists and Le Pen to pick the quote-unquote lesser evil. So my kind of starting point was that there was a rough sort of equidistance of blame between the centre and the left on this. But you took a different view. So do you want to set out why you disagreed with that?
Yeah, I'm not sure about the equidistance. So the first thing to note is that, look, I mean, there was a more important election. We're talking about this election. These elections matter. They're actually mattering a lot more than they have for a long time. But the presidential election is more important than this election. It just is. There was a more important election a few months ago. And in that more important election, Mélenchon lost and was beaten in the first round. And if Marine Le Pen was going to win, it bluntly, as I said several times on this podcast and wrote and so on, her path to victory depended on Mélenchon's voters staying home, if not actively voting for her. If enough Mélenchon voters had stayed home rather than voting for Macron, or even not necessarily voting for her, for Marine Le Pen would have won. Her path to victory depended on enough Mélenchon voters staying home, and they didn't. And so I think they've already done it. They've already, to a large extent, done their bit. And indeed, not only this year, but also in 2017, when the same thing happened at the Republican front, the anti-Rassemblement National electoral strategy, when they upheld that in 2017. So that's the first thing to say. The second is in the run-up to the legislative elections, when the NUP looked like Macron's biggest threat, and that it probably wasn't going to win enough seats to have a majority on its own, but it might, and indeed it did, win enough seats to deny Macron his majority. When that looked like the kind of preeminent threat facing Macron's allies, and his political camp started equating both the NUP and the Rassemblement National and saying both extremes are as bad as each other, we should reject both extremes, and they put both on an equal footing. And I think this was frankly wrong for several reasons. So first of all, the NUP is not just Mélenchon, it's also Green, Socialists and Communists. And all three of those parties are established parts of the political mainstream in France. Yes, even the Communists, who were for a very long time a major political force in French politics and are now a much more minor force in French politics, but they are responsible parts of the political mainstream. They're a minor party now, but they run cities, they run municipalities, and they have a generally quite good reputation. So it wasn't just Mélenchon. And if indeed, by some miracle, there had been a majority of NUP MPs in Parliament, a very big chunk of those would have been Greens, Communists and socialists. And in the same way as Macron's feet are now going to be held to the fire by every little faction within Ensemble, you've got Philippe's party Horizon, the Republicans, the Modem, and so on, all these different kind of factions. All those other factions within the NUP would have demanded moderation and kind of created a certain element of moderation from the NUP and from Mélenchon's kind of leadership.
Of course, that isn't really comparable with the RN, is it? I think listening to this, I do find it pretty persuasive.
I might be wrong, but I'm not sure that Mélenchon's allies and kind of his political camp ever said that Macron and Le Pen were equally bad. What they said was they resented having to choose between both for the second time and having a political system which denies them any representation if they don't. It's a kind of winner-takes-all system, and they have to choose in the second round, and they are bluntly blackmailed by saying you have to pick Macron or you get the far right. I'm not sure that they ever said both are equally bad. We equate both. And what Macron's allies, by contrast, did was equating both the NUP and the RN, which, like, again, the NUP might have been some kind of indigenist France Insoumise candidate in your constituency, but it might also be some sort of socialist municipal councillor who 5 or 10 years ago would have been part of the majority in parliament of a governing party, or a Green, or even a communist. And that's, I think, the kind of critical mistake. And indeed, what happened was that there are disagreements among different polling institutes, but it seems like in the around 60 second rounds where NUP candidates were facing the RN, either 48 or 70% of Ensemble voters abstained, and they refused to pick the NUP over the RN. And when the RN was winning by 51, 52, 53%, that clearly made enough difference to mean that they got through. And I really think it bears saying the largest RN delegation in parliamentary history it's on Macron. It's Macron's fault.
Yeah. I mean, another aspect in which this is on Macron, I suppose, is precisely the point you make about many of these NUP candidates coming from the socialists or the Greens. And certainly my view on Macron is that, on the Macron project, is that one of its biggest failures has been to bind in the centre-left, which I think was within his reach when he set out in 2016, 2017. Yet, as president, he has conspicuously governed more to the centre-right than to the centre-left. And I think he has neglected those voters in that part of the electorate who might have been willing converts to En Marche and now Ensemble. So there too, I suppose you can say that this broad tent that they wrongly described as being equivalent to the RN is also a product of his own failings as president. But I mean, that kind of brings us to the sort of where we are now. And I'm just listening to your points here. It feels like French politics is in for a very rocky ride. That's a fair assessment.
If you're enjoying France Elects, you might want to consider subscribing. We have a special offer for podcast listeners, 12 weeks for £12 or €12 in Europe. Just go to newstatesman.com/podcast offer. And you can read all our international coverage at newstatesman.com/international.
From the New Statesman comes a new podcast, Audio Long Reads, the best of our reported features and essays read aloud.
Songs are like tattoos, Mitchell said on Blue. Having one written about you is immortality and fiction rolled into one.
Featuring writing from our authors, including Kate Mossman on Joni Mitchell's former muse and lover, Jeremy Cliffe on his journey through France before this year's presidential election, and Sophie McBain on the refugee crisis.
"Don't die," he kept shouting. He didn't answer when Mardware screamed back, "Who is dying?"
Ease into the weekend with our audio long reads, published every Saturday morning. Just search Audio Long Reads wherever you get your podcasts.
So all the talk in France at the moment is about this gridlock and what do you do when you have a National Assembly without any clear majority. This is a very novel occurrence in France. Obviously, we're sat here in Germany. It's much less of a novel idea in countries with more of a culture of political consensus and less of a kind of winner-takes-all culture, which is indeed what many advocates of hung parliament or denying Macron's majority say. It's a good thing. But so what happens now is there are a few options. So the first is that Macron agrees a kind of coalition, most likely with the Republicans, and it's a kind of governing agreement, and that allows him to have a government which controls the confidence of Parliament. Another option is a kind of forming ad hoc majorities on different texts. That probably at this point seems the most likely, and you'd probably get many Republicans. As you say, there's a split between the nationalist wing of the Republicans and the more kind of liberal Macron compatible wing of the Republicans. But that is also an option. And if that were to happen, there's a very powerful tool available to minority French governments, which is Article 49.3 of the Constitution, which is a very controversial article allowing the government to pass laws without a vote in exchange for a confidence motion that it has to survive. Since reform in 2008, that can only be used once a parliamentary session. But for example, under François Hollande, who similarly had some difficulties with Parliament and because of a recalcitrant faction of left-wingers, that measure was used repeatedly. And so it is possible that we might see a lot more of the 49.3 than we've seen in the previous legislature when it was used, I think, only once. And then the final option is Parliament simply being dissolved after maybe a year, which is already an option that Macron's allies are floating because they say that it's ungovernable. The question really is, how far can the institutions of the Fifth Republic cope with this kind of fairly novel situation? And the institutions and also the political culture. No party in France is used to sharing power. Coalitions don't exist in France. And that's the real kind of question. Can the political culture and the institutions of the Fifth Republic, which, are basically orientated towards a strong executive and a fairly marginalised parliament, to what extent can they adapt to this quite novel political situation?
Yeah, I refuse to see this in a purely negative light. I do think that part of not all of it, but part of the disillusionment felt by some French people, part of the reasons for the current political divides is the fact that particularly Macron, but also previous presidents, has been able to ram through his agenda without having to take into account squaring off differences, reconciling trade-offs, binding people into what he was trying to do. And it might be a disaster. It might mean deadlock, maybe new elections, maybe even a new series of France Elects. Definitely not a bad thing. But on the positive, I do wonder, I think this sort of reckoning was probably going to happen sooner or later. And if it does start to change the political culture and maybe even begin a debate about constitutional change, the kind of the long-mooted Sixth Republic, which, as I've written before, I think is a debate that France probably needs to have, then that could actually be a good thing. So I will allow myself a little hint of optimism as we wrap up here.
No, absolutely. And you have a lot of people saying it's a good thing. Look, the reality of the institutions of the Fifth Republic has been the first choice of between a quarter and a third of voters gets all the political power. That's how it works, because they win in the first round and then they win in the second round and then they get a majority in parliament a couple of months later. And that means that you end up with 2/3 to 3/4 of voters who are essentially completely marginalized and who have no political power whatsoever in any given electoral cycle. And maybe if it forces more of a culture of compromise, more of a culture of negotiations, and allows different interests to be represented in the political system, that's not such a bad thing. It's the norm in many European countries. We're sat here in Germany. It's clearly the norm here. Even the UK has had coalitions. Any number of European countries have this culture of compromise and coalition and negotiation. And maybe it's time for France to also learn a bit of that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, before we go, we've got some news. We're thrilled to announce the launch of the New Statesman's new app this week, which is available now in the Apple app and Google Play stores.
We would say this, but it really is a thing of beauty. You can now enjoy our award-winning journalism from both print and online within the app. But you can also listen to all of our New Statesman, World Review and Long Reads podcasts within it. Toggle between the international and UK editions and check out our striking photography and illustrations.
Indeed, why not take the opportunity to go into the long read section and listen to my recent travelogue on Macron's France, which touches on some of these subjects, read in the dulcet tones of producer Adrian. So if for no other reason, then that's one to download the new app immediately and enjoy it on your mobile or tablet in the way that suits you.
Very smooth, Jeremy. That's it for this final episode of France Elects. We hope you've enjoyed this series examining French politics in depth, from foreign policy to the rise of the far right. If you've enjoyed it, please do leave us a review. Our producer has been Adrian Bradley. Thanks for listening.